and Social Committee. My name is Ben Allen. I'm the Research Director at the Institute for European Environmental Policy, and I'm stepping in today in place of our Executive Director, Céline Charberiat. Céline sends her sincere apologies for not being able to attend and moderate today's session. She's still recovering from some surgery that she had last week. I'd also like to take this opportunity to point out that we did intend for our panel to be gender balanced today. In inviting panel members, it was noticeable how male-dominated this particular field is. And as an artifact of me stepping in as moderator, I'm afraid I'm reinforcing that bias. So for that, you have my apologies. We know there are many women working in this field, and in particular among ministers in member states that are playing a key role, and we had invited some of them. And we remain committed to engaging them and the work of other women in this area as we go forwards. I'd also like to take this opportunity to invite those of you who are working in this field to perhaps reach out to us so that we can invite you to future events as well and future panels. Today's running order will be a brief introduction from myself to set the scene before we hear from our excellent panel members, who I'll introduce in due course. In terms of general housekeeping, the webinar is being recorded. It will be streamed live on YouTube. There will be an opportunity for participants to ask questions in the Q&A tool on Zoom, but not verbally. I will aim to keep track of some of these questions as they come in, with support from the team working in the background here, and then present them to the panel later in this session. If you want to tweet about the session, the hashtag for this is fiscal matters, hashtag fiscal matters, all one word. So I'll begin with a brief intervention, and then we will go to our keynote speaker. It's clear that tax systems across the EU are, on the whole, neither green enough nor fair enough. It's exactly 10 years since the Resource Efficiency Roadmap called for 10% of government revenues from environmental taxes, but this figure is still stuck at no more than 5 or 6%. Forthcoming research, led by our Institute for DG Environment, shows that EU tax systems do not make polluters pay for the cost of their environmental damage. Just 44% of total air pollution and greenhouse gas costs of some 720 billion euros a year are internalized in taxation. For water pollution, it's less than 5%, and it's even less for waste management, water scarcity, or biodiversity loss. And across the board, it seems to be households that pay the highest share of their environmental costs, whilst many industries get a free ride. The vast majority of our environmental taxes are taxes on energy, but even here we see that there's misalignment with some of the objectives of the Green Deal. The Energy Taxation Directive, which is proposed to be revised, and which I'm sure Director General Erasmo Thomas is going to talk much more about in a moment, perfectly shows the problems and challenges we face. It creates perverse incentives, both social and environmental, at the moment, which is why reforms are so important. To give some examples of this, coal for heating and cooling is taxed less than gas. Gas for heating and cooling is taxed less than electricity, despite the need to electrify everything to achieve carbon neutrality. It's similar when we look at transport fuels, with diesel being taxed less than petrol, and we see some of the environmental costs of that in cities like Brussels, whilst aviation shipping fuel is barely taxed at all. It's a regime which de facto favors fossil fuels over renewables, but also industry over households, and it seems to favor high income men, more likely to drive tax-exempt company cars or fly business class, most of all. We can and need to do better, and we'll hear more in a moment from the Director General about what the Commission's proposed reforms look like in this respect, and from our panel in general on reflections on how we can move forwards in this area. We also know from our work that tax systems are, on the whole, not fair enough either. Top personal income tax rates have been declining for 30 years, as have corporate income tax rates. We only have to look at the gains made by billionaires during the pandemic to know that the capital is widely undertaxed as well. Now, these two things, the greenness of our tax system and the fairness of our tax systems, also seem to be closely related. Ongoing analysis that we're doing, which we'll publish soon, is finding clear correlation. Countries with the highest rates of internalization of environmental costs, and I'll say what that means, into taxes are also those with the highest top rates of income tax, the highest corporate and capital taxes, and critically some of the lowest income rates for low-income earners. Conversely, those with the lowest rates of internalization of environmental costs into taxes also have very low rates on high earners, corporate incomes and capital, but also some of the highest rates for low-income earners as well. When we talk about the internalization of environmental costs, if you're not a particular economic specialist or a tax expert, we mean here the process of building in the cost of environmental damage into taxes on those activities or products that cause that damage. And our research shows that there is therefore a double dividend available to those countries if they shift tax burdens from low-income earners to the environment, helping making taxes both fairer and greener. This event here today is about asking whether the COVID-19 recovery and the Fit for 55 package just launched by the European Commission offers opportunities for green taxation shift in Europe. We've got some brilliant speakers, which I'm really pleased to introduce today, and I'll come to those in due course. But first, let me give the floor and a very warm welcome to our keynote speaker, Director General Gerasimos Thomas of Directorate General for Taxation and Customs Union. Gerasimos is very well placed to talk about these topics. Not only is he the DG with responsibility for Energy Taxation Directive revision, he's also the former Deputy Minister of Environment and Energy in Greece, and he's held numerous roles in the European Commission, including as Deputy DG of DG Energy and Deputy Spokesperson of President Prodi. Gerasimos, thank you for being with us today. We're keen to hear your views on the opportunities to reform tax systems to better align with the objectives of the European Green Deal, and of course, in particular about the Commission's vision for the reform of energy taxes. DG Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much to the organizers for putting together this event. And I think you have summarized very well the key aspects of this. So I don't know if I have too much more to add. I will be keen to listen. We have made our proposals and we will be keen to listen also to the views of the other speakers in the audience. It is true that there are only a few things that are now, few issues that are in the current international debate that are more important than our collective ambition for green transition. The climate and the biodiversity crisis are here, and we know that we need to act now before it is too late. For some, it is already too late. We all know that this transition will be challenging, but it is the only way to preserve the planet for our children and grandchildren. And more than that, if it is done right, this transition, it is our blueprint for a prosperous economy that better meets the citizens' needs, enhances health and the quality of life. The Green Deal is a cornerstone of Europe's recovery strategy. It does not only commit to climate neutrality, it also sets out concrete targets on how to get there. And the coming decade, from now to 2030, will be crucial in this strategy. And that's why we have this comprehensive package to deliver on necessary emissions reductions by 2030. We need to achieve substantial progress by 2030 in order to have enough time then to decarbonize completely by 2050. This package is built around reformed and a strengthened ETS, closely linked to the EU ETS reform. We have the carbon border adjustment mechanism, the revision of the Energy Taxation Directive, and a large number of regulatory measures. So it is like a triangle where we have the market mechanisms on the top, and we have a large part of regulatory measures and some tax measures. And all these components equally contribute to the 55% reduction. And they are interlinked, because if we do less market reforms, we will have to do more regulation or more taxation to compensate. I will speak about the objective and the specific design features of the Energy Tax Directive in a moment. But let me note that this event is not only about green taxation, but about tax reform more broadly in support of the green transition. And yes, we need green taxes. We need an increased use of energy and environmental taxes if we want to deliver on our environmental objectives. But this will only work if it is part of a holistic and balanced tax reform, taken into account distributional implications as well as the impact on competitiveness and innovation in the EU. Now, let me start with the Energy Tax Directive, which as it stands is completely outdated and has lost its purpose. It was developed in the 90s, and the minimum rates in place since 2013 are so low that all the national rates are above the so-called minimum rates. A lot has changed since 2013. The green ambitions have moved higher up in the policy preferences in all member states. And if in a lot of areas, if not in most of the areas, the member states have higher tax rates than the ones prescribed in the Energy Tax Directive. The current directive, as it was said by Ben, de facto subsidizes fossil fuels over renewables. Its minimum tax rates have not been adjusted for inflation, and it contains a lot of unjustified exemptions in the current policy framework. Exceptions that undermine the policy objectives per se of the ETD, which are to encourage the sustainable energy consumption, to avoid distortions in the single market, to maintain the revenue-raising capacity of member states. The objective of the revision of the directive is, on the one hand, to remove such subsidies to fossil fuels, and on the other hand, to promote greenhouse gas emission reductions through energy efficiency and a higher uptake of less polluting alternative fuels. In particular, the current approach of taxing fuels according to volume and not according to their energy content discriminates against renewable fuels in favor of conventional fossil fuels. The revision will make energy content the basis for taxation. The revised directive will set clear rules so that investors and innovators can plan their long-term investment in renewables. It will make the transition towards cleaner energy sources accountable, reliable, and affordable. We should not forget that environmental taxes have a dual objective, enabling the green transition while generating revenue that can be used to invest in green infrastructure or compensate vulnerable households often hit hardest by those measures. Even at the moment, less than 5% of EU27 tax revenue comes from energy taxes, even today, while more than 10 times as much comes from labor taxes. But if we do not update the energy tax rules, energy tax revenues are set to erode as we move to climate neutrality. Let me be clear, the climate targets are set and we will reach them. The question is which instruments we will use on our way to 2050, and green taxation needs to play a clear central role as part of a holistic green policy and overall energy regulation. As long as those who waste resources or damage the environment can do it without immediate consequences, they will continue to do so at the expense of the rest of humankind and of the biosphere as a whole. Green taxes can get this right in an efficient way. With green taxes, it is possible to set a price to these social costs and therefore encourage behavioral changes by companies and citizens that support environmental sustainability. In order to be effective, environmental taxes must fit into a wider policy context. We need to take into account that the transition towards this neutrality requires a deep structural change of the society. The green taxes need to fit into and complement and reinforce a broader policy mix that integrates pricing instruments, subsidies, standards, regulatory instruments, and investment in public infrastructure. The EU finances a number of policies that support the investments needed for the transition to a climate neutral, competitive, and inclusive economy. Some 37% of the spending of the Recovery and Resilience Facility, for instance, will support the green transition. A similar, if not higher amount, higher than 40%, will be used for such investments under the structural funds. The innovation and the modernization funds will address transition needs for investments included in the most affected regions or sectors. I spoke earlier about the distributional implication of green taxes. This is important, and I am convinced that we always need to think about this in the overall tax mix when we reform individual taxes, and it's the same for green taxes. The tax benefit system will provide some answers, for example, by targeted cuts on labor taxes for low-income households. This way, we will avoid some of the distributional impacts of the transition. Direct fiscal compensation may be another option, but I believe we should not shy away from earmarking green tax revenue for such purposes. The Commission already follows a similar approach with the Climate Social Facility, which will use additional ETS revenue to cushion the social ramification of the green transition. We will finally need to reflect more broadly about modernizing our tax systems in line of the green and digital twin transitions. I'm sure that green taxes will play an increasingly important role, but this needs to be carefully calibrated, taking into account efficiency consideration. In our recent communication of business taxation for the 21st century, we announced a collective reflection process on these issues, which conclude in a tax symposium in the EU tax mix on the road to 2050. This tax symposium will take place next year, 2022, most probably in the second half. I invite you all to contribute and engage in this debate, who will be key to our journey to a climate neutral Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Asimo, for that speech and those introductions and reflections. I think that's a great context to help frame our debate today. My main work focuses on sustainable finance taxonomy, which I know is a different mechanism to what we're talking about today, but that question about financing the transition, clear signposting of the direction where we need to move our capital flows towards European Green Deal objectives it's good to hear that from a tax perspective as well. Before we move to our panel, I'd like to ask you a question, and let's just drill a little bit more into this question around national politics and how to get the Energy Taxation Directive passed this time around amidst concerns from some groups in some member states. Do you think the conditions are different now? And are you confident that, or do you have confidence that the ETD will pass through?
Are you asking to me?
To you, sorry.
Yeah,
yes.
okay. Yes, of course I'm confident, otherwise I wouldn't propose it. So no, I think it is a necessary, I think it is important in this Fit for 55 package to see that the first, let's say, priority for the Commission to achieve the target of reduction of 55%. And as I say, there are different measures and they are linked. Frankly speaking, if the contribution, the final outcome of the negotiations is an energy taxation directive that contributes less, the important thing is that it is compensated with other measures. We cannot only take things out of this package, we have to put something else in. And I think initially, people will look at member states, the industry, it's natural. My people, the people in the Commission, they look at their directive, their regulatory proposal, their ETS reform. And what we have done collectively is to link them. And at the very end, if they wait, at the moment, the contribution of the Energy Taxation Directive as it is to the overall effort to move from 43 to 55% is around 8%. So if it becomes 12, fine. If it becomes 6, fine, as long as it is compensated. So I think that's what I will say. I think we have calculated what we believe is the best balance, the best mix. We have, in terms of rates, a very backloaded system by which the minimum rates rise over a 10-year period. So we don't start by increasing the rates. We start by adjusting the base, by adjusting the hierarchy of taxes, and only then we go on up. We give a time to the transition to adjust the rates. Some people argue for a different mix, and it will be good to debate it. But after doing a very, let's say, thorough impact assessment and working with on the same model, we have worked on the same model with our colleagues in Klima, in Ener, in MOVE. So all the regulatory measures are on the same baseline model. We think that it is the best, sequencing of the reforms. Change the base, change the hierarchy, change the rates. But I think the important thing is that the holistic package works. Each individual measure, can be adjusted.
Perfect, thank you. I think we'll have the opportunity to exchange more on this topic in the panel shortly. Thank you again for giving the keynote introduction. We'll now move to introduce our panel and ask each in turn to give no more than 5 minutes reflections and opening remarks, just to set out where they're at in the debate, where their perspectives are, and so that the audience, the listeners, get an idea of who our panel is as well. So first, I'm going to go to Rebecca Christie. Rebecca is a fellow at Bruegel since 2019. Bruegel is a European think tank that specializes in economics. She was previously a political correspondent in Brussels for Bloomberg News, and among a variety of roles, she's been an expert advisor to the European Economic and Social Committee on Taxation. Rebecca, I wonder if you could give us a more political take on the Commission proposal for the ETD reform and tax policies in general, and give your initial reflections. Over to you.
Thanks very much for including me in your panel today. I am delighted to be here with such a great group of fellow panelists, and I am also kind of excited about the Energy Taxation Directive proposal and plan. I think it's one of the more practical pieces of legislation to be in front of the Commission right now. It focuses on things that are within the EU's control, that are likely to make a difference, phasing out a lot of these subsidies and tax breaks that work in the opposite direction of greening the economy, and also creating not only some revenues, not only some incentives for companies to switch to more renewable energy, but also a more level playing field, which helps the entire single market. Generally, the climate is more likely to have the attention and resources it needs if the entire economy is in good shape and able to mobilize resources to do public works projects. I say that very broadly. If you look at the pandemic recovery plan, there's been a real effort to channel that fiscal stimulus into environmental projects and projects that will have a positive benefit on the environment going forward. To do that, you have to have money in the first place. And that requires, to my mind, a more general focus, a broader focus. I think the Commission deserves a lot of credit for picking and choosing among its proposals to see which ones are the most important. I would like to give the Commission credit for postponing some of the own resources proposals, the digital levy, until after some of these other things have passed, just to make sure that the focus isn't taken away. I think also it was probably a good move to move toward green bond issuance for the NGEU program in a more general way than really sticking to the taxonomy and some of the rules that are forthcoming, because they're not fully in place yet. And the goal is to be able to access capital markets. If you have money from capital markets, you can spend it on projects. And that's much more important to me than what kind of label you stick on your bond. Looking globally outside the EU, the OECD tax talks that are going on right now, and I very much hope to hear from David how things are looking for this month, are promising because they improve the prospects that companies around the world will pay their fair share wherever they are. Once that happens, the EU will have a tough task to implement them at the EU level. But I think from what we heard so far and from what Hieronymus has said in recent remarks, there's at least a plan to only issue directives where they're necessary to try and bring everybody on board, to really and try and get the EU pulling together. Now, the forces working against this are strong. Tax legislation is complicated. In the EU, it requires unanimity. And there is a real incentive for everyone to look at their national interests and wait for other people to move first before making any concessions. The EU has had a lot of success in passing small tax directives in recent years. If you look at a lot of the anti-abuse and transparency and information exchange measures that have come in recent years, they've sort of chipped away at it. And I think they've come farther than people might have thought. So going forward, ETD, great. It might need to be broken up into several packages to try and get it through all at once, bring the countries together, and focus on making sure the economy has the revenue it needs so that projects can be funded.
Wonderful, thank you, Rebecca. I'm not going to dwell with each participant immediately after the reflections. We'll do that through the panel discussions, but thank you for giving that perspective. I'll move now to David. You've already put a question to David, Rebecca, in terms of hearing how the OECD is getting on. David Bradbury, our next panelist, is the head of tax policy at the OECD. He joined the OECD in 2014. Prior to joining the OECD, David was a lawyer. He was a member of the House of Representatives in the Australian Parliament and a minister in the Australian government. David, perhaps you could give us your reflections and touch on how the EU compares with other OECD countries. And if you, this is a difficult question, if you were advising member state governments now, what would you tell them to do with their green tax systems, to green their tax systems? David, over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Ben. It's great to join you on this occasion, and thank you for those questions. And thanks to Rebecca as well for her question. In fact, I'm filling in at the last minute for Pascal Saint-Amand because he is engaged in some of the ongoing negotiations as part of the international tax discussions. So I can't give anything away, no breaking news today, but we certainly are working very closely with all of the member jurisdictions of the inclusive framework with a view towards reaching a consensus in the coming weeks. In terms of the question you asked, Ben, about the extent to which the EU countries are making good progress compared to other countries, this is something that we have spent a fair bit of resourcing over the years focused in particular in the area of pricing. And many of you would be familiar with work that we do on an ongoing basis around effective carbon rates. And generally, through the metrics that we consider under the effective carbon rates methodology, we see that European countries generally are much more inclined to use pricing as a mechanism for addressing climate change. It's a key climate change mitigation policy. Now, in the effective carbon rates, we take into account carbon taxes, emissions trading schemes, but we also take into account implicit pricing in the form of fuel excise taxes. Now, I guess the one caveat that I would introduce at this point, and I think it's an important counterpoint to the discussion, is that whilst at the OECD, we certainly have never resolved from the fact that we think that explicit carbon pricing is amongst the most effective tools that governments can introduce as part of their climate change mitigation policies. We think that they need to be one component as part of overall policy packages. And some of those policy tools in the package may involve pricing, but others may not involve explicit pricing. And we think it is important to take into account the range of policies in their totality and the extent to which ultimately they are effective in reducing emissions that would otherwise be contributed by any particular country. So yes, in terms of pricing, the EU is definitely doing quite well comparatively to many other jurisdictions. But I think it's also fair to make this observation that many other non-EU jurisdictions, for whatever reason, have often relied upon non-pricing tools and instruments to a greater extent. I think there is, to some extent, some political economy factors that drive that, but that is something that I think needs to be taken into account. And in fact, as part of our ongoing work, we've recognised the importance of trying to broaden the extent to which we measure the policy stringency of the overall policies that governments have in place to try and see if there are ways of determining what might be the equivalent price signal of some of these policies that are generating implicit prices, as it were. So we think that's going to be important. In terms of the advice that we give to countries, I think that we are always very mindful of the challenges in the political economy. We see many examples, and from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, the issues are often different, but the theme is the same. And that is that when introducing many of the carbon mitigation policies and climate mitigation policies that countries have at their disposal, there will be adverse impacts, differential impacts across different population groups. And it's absolutely essential that this question of just transition is at the heart of our thinking. And, you know, it's not just socioeconomic demographic groups. It depends upon the regional nature of where some individuals may be located, access to substitutes and alternatives. The position is not the same for all households. It's not the same for all businesses, but in particular, not for all households. And we think that that needs to be at the centre of policy. And indeed, from the business perspective, competitiveness obviously is a key and central concern, as too is the question of carbon leakage. And to the extent that countries both across the EU but beyond the EU are able to work cooperatively towards trying to mitigate some of these potential spillovers is something that we are very supportive of and wanting to the extent that we can, to continue to work with countries towards trying to minimise those impacts. So perhaps that's a good place to start the discussion, but certainly looking forward to having the opportunity to come back a little bit later on.
Wonderful, thank you, David. And you have my sympathy for filling in at the last minute, but we're very grateful for your interventions there. Yeah, some really interesting points. Again, we're not going to come back immediately directly to you. We'll hear from the next panelist, and then we'll go into a panel discussion where we can reflect on some of the things people have said. So thank you for that intervention. Our fourth and final panelist is Professor Jakob Kappeler. Jakob describes himself as a philosopher who accidentally became an economist, an easy mistake to make perhaps. He's a professor at the University of Duisburg-Essen and head of the Institute for Comprehensive Analysis of the Economy at Johannes Kepler University Linz, and edits the Heterodox Economics newsletter. Jakob, perhaps in your intervention, I know you have some slides to present as well, you could say whether you think there is a trade-off or complementarity between green and fair taxes from the work you do. We've just heard from David here about this just transition element being really important in the advice that's given to member states and countries. Perhaps you can reflect on that. Jakob, over to you.
Yeah, many thanks for having me here today, and many thanks for this interesting question. I would argue generally that we always have to strive for synergies in this context, so we do not have the time to be kept up with trade-offs. We have to focus on synergies, and I think there are a lot of synergies between fair and green taxation possible if taxation systems are well designed. But today I want to focus on just another synergy, namely the synergy between a fairer tax system as a whole and the possibility to boost the investment planned for getting a socio-ecological transformation going. And this is why my talk is about a European wealth tax as a possible means to boost the European Green Deal. So I'll take this opportunity to introduce two recent studies I wrote with two colleagues from the UK. And here's the first one, how to boost the European Green Scale and Ambition. In this study, we basically do a reassessment of the investment requirements for getting Europe carbon neutral. And main difference to what you might have read from others is that we truly try to base our climate targets on the natural sciences and not so much on political compromise. And when doing so, we find that there is the required investment that is higher than expected. Specifically, we find a huge investment gap here between 216 billion per year as planned at the time of writing and the necessary investment of 850 billion a year. So a huge investment gap. And the finding of this investment gap motivated another study where we explored, so to say, the potential of a European wealth tax to compensate this gap. And we did so by using data from the ECB's Household Finance and Consumption Survey, and you can access all the results of the study online. So key insights of this study have been that the concentration of wealth in Europe is much greater than expected. The top 1% holds 32% of total wealth. The poorer half only holds 1.5%. We find that the European wealth tax could levy substantial revenues between 200 and 1,300 billion euros, depending on the assumptions you make on the data, but also depending, of course, on the tax model you choose. And we also find that most of the tax models that we study would only affect a small share of about 1 to 3% of the population. So now we could, of course, discuss some political arguments here. I think wealth taxes always has something to do with fairness. It has to do with creating a policy space, and it has to do with creating capacities to future challenges. And maybe this final point here, a capacity to confront future challenges, is the main connection between the wealth tax and the Green Deal. So let me go to the results. So this slide is simply to not everybody deals with the wealth distribution daily. So this slide is to give you an impression of the rough structure of the European wealth distribution. We see here that the poorest 20% in terms of wealth have less than 8,000 euros net wealth, whereas the richest 20% have more than about 300,000 euros, okay? And for taxation purposes, we want to understand what's going on at the top here, and this is a little difficult, and you need some statistics, but at the end of the day, what we find is this. We find that the richest 10% of European households have more than 500,000 euros, richest 3% have more than 1 million, and richest 1% starts, so to say, with about 2 million euros. We always talk about net wealth here, so it's asset minus liabilities. And so this is simply to give you some orientation with regard to the numbers. And when we now, so to say, think about wealth taxation, we studied 4 different models. And basically the idea is to have an increasing progressivity. So model 1 is linear, it's not really progressive. And then model 3, 4, 5 become more and more progressive. And this is basically the table that shows what we did. So what we assumed in model 1 is that for every euro you have above €1 million net wealth, you pay 2% tax. And this is how you read this table. So you see here that we also have progressive models where the tax rate is increasing, with wealth. I won't go into the details here. Maybe I can answer something in the questions. You can find all these online, and these are basically the assumptions behind our tax schemes. And these are already the results to give you an impression about the magnitude, about what is possible with such a wealth tax. So again, getting rid of all the details, this column 3 here would show you, I would say, a plausible estimate that it considers both a statistical correction of the tail of the data, which is not so accurate in the service, but also the assumption that some tax evasion is going on, okay? And in these models, we find that even a conservative model, so a linear flat tax starting with 1 million euros, would bring about 200 billion euros of revenue. And this could significantly boost the European Green Deal. And the more progressive model, as the example here shown here, would even bring about 360 billion euros. So in a nutshell, we have the possibility here to significantly boost the planned investments for getting Europe carbon neutral. We can double it, and we can double it in a way where only 1 to 3% of the European population is affected by such a tax. So I would say this is a form of win-win, but maybe not the way you expected it. I'm leaving it at that. Many thanks for having me and for your patience.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jakob. I think it's really great to see some concrete numbers around the win-wins as well. So that will really help with our discussion. We'll now go to we've heard from all of our panelists. We'll now go to our moderated panel discussion for around 20 minutes before bringing in any questions that we have from our audience. We're starting to get some questions come through, but again, I'd just like to remind everyone listening that you can write into the chat in the Q&A function. We might not get to all of the questions, but they are really helpful for us in just hearing what is of interest to people listening into these sorts of debates from all different backgrounds. And I'm sure that's going to be helpful for our collective work and no doubt useful for the Commission to hear in the development of tax policy going forwards. I will break my own rules here, but very briefly, Jakob, we have one question in the chat saying, could the presentation be shared so that the links are available, please? If you want to answer live in the chat, then that will be visible to everyone, and then they can just click on that. Otherwise, we'll find some way of either tweeting or I can
just say that I can happily share the slides and simply write me an email, and you can also post it online if you receive it from me, so no problem.
Awesome. Thank you, Jakob. So before we go into the moderated discussion, where we'll go through some questions and sort of explore the issues that we've heard so far, I'd like to see if Gerasimos would have any immediate reactions or would like to make any responses to what he's heard so far. Absolutely fine if not.
Yes.
But
Thank you very much. Just two quick comments. Thank you for the debate. First of all, on the comment of Rebecca on the challenges, let's say, of implementing the OECD report reform, I think I just want to say that we will be very proactive on this. We have already in May issued a communication saying what exactly we will do to implement the global agreements, and the Commission will be very proactive. The timing is very essential, and there is a unique momentum around G7, G20, OECD countries to implement this package quickly. And I think the implementation timetable under discussion as we speak, chaired in meetings with Pascal in parallel here, is to have a very ambitious implementation timetable. The second issue I want to comment on David's references to the variety of tools on carbon pricing and non-pricing initiatives. It is true, as I said from the beginning, we need to achieve the targets, our targets in Europe or worldwide. We need different tools, and we need regulatory tools, market tools, pricing, tax. I think Europe has a long tradition of non-pricing tools. We started by regulation. And so some international partners, they say, oh, you have carbon pricing, but we don't need it. We will do everything with regulation or with other, let's say, non-market-based tools and policy tools and instruments. Our experience, and we are one of the most regulated, let's say, continents in the world, is that regulation is not enough. So when you do the maths, you will see that, you know, if you only do regulation, it's not enough, and you need to, let's say, add market-based tools, not necessarily ETS, but something market-based tools in order to arrive to the targets on time. And as to Jakob, I think it's a very interesting input and reflection to our tax symposium for next year. And I don't want to take much more of the time. I'll listen to the rest of the debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerasimos. Thanks for giving those immediate reactions. Just to answer that previous question about making available the speeches, making available the presentations, we do intend to be asking all speakers for their presentations and share them on the website. So we'll communicate that to that afterwards. So they should be available. If not, we'll respond directly in the Q&A in the chat. Right, so we'll go into our discussion then with all of our panelists. We'll start with questions then and look at whether we feel the current EU tax system is consistent with the Green Deal objectives. And we'll do this, we'll go through a couple of questions and then we'll come to the audience questions that we're starting to receive. So the first question I've got for our panel then is, to what extent are tax systems across the EU currently aligned or misaligned with the objectives of the Green Deal, and which factors explain the extent of that alignment between our tax systems and Green Deal objectives? Does anyone want to pick that up first? I'd initially flagged Rebecca to give a first intervention, but I hate picking on individuals, but I see you smiling, Rebecca.
I can give some basic thoughts. Tax codes are very complicated, and I will refrain from singling out individual member states because that's way more tax codes than I can keep in my head. Broadly speaking, we know that tax systems have been around for a long time. We know that fossil fuels often have been subsidized more or less directly, either as a way of promoting national infrastructure or as a way of continuing legacy thoughts or other sorts of things. We also know that more generally, the EU system favors taxing equity over debt. And so to the extent you have a debt-financed industry like a fossil fuel industry, you may be tax advantaged among other types of financing advantage than somebody who is trying to finance themselves on capital markets. So there are a lot of ways in which legacy industries, which because they're older are often attached to older forms of energy consumption, benefit from the tax code. That's very complicated. It's not something you can fix easily by just saying we want to help people put solar panels up. But it is something that can be chipped away at and improved over time.
Thanks, Rebecca. Does anyone else want to come in from the panel on this, either reacting to what Rebecca has said or addressing the question from their own perspective?
Oh, sorry. I see.
David, go first, please.
Sorry, I should have put my hand up, but very rude of me.
I'll just step out. The panel can moderate themselves.
Thanks for the opportunity to intervene. I just wanted to pick up on what I thought was a very insightful point that Rebecca just made about how the general operation of a tax code can have a whole range of implications that may not be obvious when we're thinking about the alignment or the extent of alignment between the tax system and our environmental objectives. The point she made about debt and equity treatment under tax codes is an important consideration. In fact, we did a study not that long ago where we had a look at two alternative infrastructure investment projects, one that would be considered to be a clean energy investment and one which would not be. And we saw that there was, as a result of a whole range of interactions in the existing corporate income tax system, that there was preferential treatment for the more polluting energy generating source. And that's not something that was a deliberate design of anyone when the tax system was being created, but it is an example of misalignment. But I think just conceptually, the way we would think about this question of alignment is to think about the extent to which the external costs are currently being internalized, to use the economic jargon. That would be to say, if there is a form of polluting going on and that is generating costs that are felt by the community more broadly, then people should have to pay for those costs. The beneficiaries of the energy production or the energy use should have to pay for those costs. So to the extent that pricing is one of the most effective ways of doing that, that is definitely one way to achieve this. But I think the other side of the ledger is really important as well, and that is the extent to which we might provide preferential treatment for certain activities. So I guess pricing is the stick to some extent, but it can be a carrot for some industries. But then if we think about the extent to which incentives are provided, we can incentivize investments in clean energy. We can incentivize investments that will be aligned with our climate objectives. But then again, we can actually provide incentives to those industries that are running in the opposite direction and are undermining our efforts. And I guess fossil fuel subsidies are one example of that as well. So conceptually and in general terms, these are the sorts of things that we sit down with countries and advise in relation to that when it comes to internalizing those external costs, that's crucial. But also think about where you provide those carrots and make sure that the carrots are incentivizing the sort of behavior that is aligned with your environmental objectives, not undermining them.
Wonderful. Thank you, David. I think Jakob was next to the initial hand raise and then Gerasimos. Jakob, please.
Yeah, I fully agree with what Rebecca said on the production side. So this is really a huge issue for reflection. So let me add something complementary on the consumption side. It is my observation that the European tax systems as a whole, from the perspective of the households, are not really strongly progressive. They are mildly progressive. And if we think about environmental taxation in terms of, in the context of consumption, these taxes are typically regressive. So what we have is we have little leeway to live up to our potential in terms of environmental consumption taxes, because we face this trade-off between the lack of progressivity in the existing systems and the regressive character of environmental taxation. And this, you could call it the yellow vest problem, of course. And let me add, so I think one solution would be to increase the progressivity of taxation in general to create some leeway. And of course, this would be complementary to this kind of ideas with compensation schemes for carbon taxes. Another thing with respect to David, so I fully agree that we need to think about pricing, about providing the carrots, as you put it so nicely. But in my view, or in my understanding, this kind of successive price changes and small changes in incentives are ideal for getting cumulative change going. But I think in some instances, especially again when it comes to the production sides, we need more path-breaking change. And this is where I would say that we have to find some form of intervention that goes beyond these incentives. We also have to have the possibility to get into the action where such path-breaking action is necessary.
Yeah, before I go to you, Erasmus, can you just give an example of what path-breaking change?
Yeah, for example, if we really so to say want to get a large reform going with regard to the sanitation and insulation of the housing sector, or if we want to have a push with regard to the changing with regard to how we produce energy. This would be cases where I would think that some path-breaking elements are necessary. And here, of course, so to say, thinking about governmental investment as a big push is the easiest thing to do. But I think, but I'm not dogmatic here, but I think we need more tools than pressing to get these path-breaking moves going.
Thank you, Jakob. Erasmus, please.
Well, just to say that, I fully agree that on the point made by Rebecca on the, looking at the green taxes as part of the overall tax system. I think that's a point that I made in the introduction. We are planning a new initiative by the end of the year to remove the debt bias, the DEBRA initiative. So we will come back on this specific issue, the example that Rebecca made. And I think the complementarity of the whole of the Fit for 55 package and agenda with the sustainable finance agenda that you, Ben, are more of a specialist is fundamental. And we have taken into account when putting together the Fit for 55 package. I think, as Rebecca said, we cannot always wait to have everything aligned before we move. There is an urgency both at the policy tool side and at the country side and at the global level. Europe moves first, and we are conscious of the first mover advantages and potential pitfalls, but I think we need to do that. And in that respect, I think the sustainable finance is also an important component in our agenda. And debt equity, debt bias has been with us for a long time in Europe, and we are going to do something about it this year.
Thanks, Erasmus. I'd like to just give Rebecca the opportunity to respond, because everyone had the opportunity to respond to her. So I'd like to give her the opportunity to respond back. And then David, perhaps I'd like to ask you to respond to Jakob as well, because he picked up on some of the sort of carrot incentive elements as well. But Rebecca first, please.
Well, thanks. I don't have that much to add. Everyone's insights are really just adding to my own knowledge as well as everything else. I do want to find that OECD study. Maybe, David, you could stick the link in the chat or send it around to us. That sounds really interesting.
Brilliant. Thanks, Rebecca. Yeah, I'm always going to give these opportunities to respond because it's much harder doing it this way than in a room. But yeah, if people don't want to respond or don't need to respond, just shake your head and I'll move on. David, would you like to respond to Jakob's points? If not, we'll move to the next question.
Well, firstly, thanks, Rebecca, once again for challenging me. I'll try and multitask and paste that link in. I'm notoriously bad at that, but we'll see how we go. Look, thanks, Jakob. And look, I largely agree with the sentiments that you express. I think that all of this discussion really points to the fact that there is no silver bullet. We really do need policy packages. They need to be as comprehensive as possible. We need to take into account not just what might be the primary focus of climate change mitigation efforts, but we need to contextualize the measures that we have in mind in a broader context. And that's in the context of not just pricing versus non-pricing policies, but environmentally related taxes versus other tax policies versus the places where governments spend their funds. I think one of the crucial elements of this discussion, and there are a whole range of pros and cons in terms of the respective instruments that governments have at their disposal. And carbon pricing, as we've always said, is one of the most effective. But one of the great benefits of carbon pricing is not only does it have that direct impact in driving behavioural responses, but it also generates revenue. And revenues are things that you can deploy to great effect. You can do that to mitigate some of the impacts on vulnerable communities, or you could deploy those revenues towards expenditure in areas that might actually support some of those breakthrough innovations that Jakob was referring to. So I think, there are a whole range of policy instruments, pros and cons, but at the end of the day, policy packages considering the extent to which these things impact on all of these dimensions is important. And of course, the one thing that I will end my comment on, and that is to say, what works in one country or one context may not work in others. And that's why it's crucial that policymakers at the local level, often aligned with others at the regional or global level, but they make the decisions that they think respond to the challenges and idiosyncrasies in some cases of a particular jurisdiction.
Brilliant. Thank you, David. I wonder then if I can come just back to Erasmus and ask a direct question just on that last thing that you said there, David, which is that what works in one country and context doesn't necessarily work in all. Now, of course, the European Union is a union of countries, but member states are different. They do have different cultural context, political context, and so on. Is there anything you can add to that, Erasmus, about how the revisions the Commission are looking at would address those sorts of changes and how they respond to that varying context as well?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure. I mean, I think we agree that there is a multiplicity of tools to deal, and the mixture of the tools in each area is different. So I don't think on this there is any disagreement. The difficulty that we think everybody around the world faces, let's say there is something that unites us, all the jurisdictions, is that we have urgency. And the past policies and the past mixture of policy tools cannot deliver, let's say, in no continent, including in ours. That's why we revised the climate deal 2 years after it was adopted. Just don't forget that we have the Clean Energy for All package was entered into law in March of this year, 2021, and we already have prepared the other package. So I think the common element is, we have different tools, we have different starting points. We use some tools more than others. We can mix them up, but what we do have, all of us, we have a great urgency to do things. And I think that's the most important issue. Now we are, as a EU, we are a group of countries. So obviously a single country might have, a small country, for example, might do a different proportion of objectives through pure regulation than we can do at the level of, let's say, of 27 countries. At the same time, take a situation like the US, they do use all the tools. I mean, they don't have a federal pricing, but half of their states, they have pricing, or they plan to introduce pricing. So at the global level, the US will use somehow some pricing instruments. Some they will be designed at state level, so I think I am convinced that there is a need for us to be aware of the policy tools, to make sure that we look at them at a holistic way, to look them against the broader framework of general tax policy, as it was said just in the previous exchange, and then move on and see what is done. But there is no room to do, there is no room to avoid acceleration of policies.
That's really clear and great to hear. I think all the participants so far on the panel have said similar things. We need to move quickly. Exactly how we move and that mixture of tools that we use may need to be different, but it doesn't take away from that urgency. I would like to move us to a question now about opportunities. Of the questions that I was going to pose to the panel, a number have been covered already in people's interventions, which is fantastic. The next question really is around what are the opportunities in the recovery from the COVID-19 crisis and that are presented by the Fit for 55 package, notably including the revision of the ETD, Energy Taxation Directive, for environmental tax reforms. So we've already heard a bit about alignment of the baseline of the approach when working out the different policies that fit into these different packages. But from my perspective, and I don't work purely in this tax field, I work in sustainable finance and other areas, it does feel to me like there's a genuine appetite for change that's growing. I mean, that's not universal, of course, but it feels to me that with that package coming out, with the opportunity to recover from the crisis, there's more that we can do, more that we can push. Do panelists have an idea about what they see or what you see as opportunities from this recovery process that would allow us to move further and quicker on tax reform?
Well, on tax reform or on climate would be the question.
However you wish to take it. So I'm talking here about, is there an opportunity to make tax reform, from environmental tax reform, move quicker to address the challenges we have, the European Green Deal objectives, one of which being climate? Has that been improved by Fit for 55, by the COVID recovery? Has that triggered something that's changed the frame?
I mean, David has his hand up. My broad
David.
thought on how to use the COVID crisis to dedicate revenues toward fixing the climate is actually not tax driven. I think, and this is my personal view, that the EU has a fantastic opportunity to dedicate more resources toward climate mitigation strategies by making the NGEU borrowing program permanent. This is something that the financial markets love, that they have priced in to stick around. We know that the member states don't want to continue the transfer union part of that because it brings up a lot of political and legal questions. However, if the EU were to continue borrowing on financial markets, it could then just divide that by 27, avoid all of the transfer union things, and spend that money on climate mitigation projects, whether it's a small amount or a large amount. That's money that the markets are lined up to give the EU. So that would be the top of my wish list, but it's not a tax issue per se.
Thanks, Rebecca. For someone like myself that's not familiar so much with the jargon, what's NGE?
This is the Next Generation EU Pandemic Recovery Program. It's the EU's 750 billion euro borrowing package. And it's the first time there's really been joint EU borrowing and a safe asset issued specifically under the institutional names. The EIB, the European Investment Bank, which does a lot of climate stuff, and also the European Stability Mechanism, which does more market access stuff, both don't have the advantages and frankly, the political support that we see now behind the Next Generation EU program.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rebecca. I'm learning a lot throughout this whole panel debate. David, to you, both to react to what Rebecca said, but also on that opportunities from recovery and Fit for 55.
Look, I think I'd begin by saying that I echo all of the comments that have been made about the urgency of the climate change challenge. But I would say that the climate change challenge is inevitably about more than tax. And what a good tax system beyond COVID looks like will be about more than environmentally related taxes. So I think there's almost a Venn diagram here, if you like, and there is a significant segment in the middle where there's overlap between these two important public policy questions, and I think it's really worth thinking about it in those terms. So when we are thinking about what the crisis means in terms of the tax system moving forward, we think that it does actually present some challenges, but some opportunities. There is a genuine desire, I think, on the part of many countries and many policymakers to build back better. It's a slogan, but it's a slogan that I think aptly reflects a desire on the part of many policymakers. And that's partly because we recognise the sort of vulnerabilities that we as a human race can encounter. We've just gone through that. This has been something in the nature of an existential crisis, and it's descended upon us much faster than the climate challenge that we are currently trying to deal with. But it is certainly no less significant. You know, these are existential questions. So I think it is important in that sense. I think as we think about the tax system and what it should look like beyond COVID, we think it's important to think about the whole range of pressures that public finances are under. And, you know, climate change is a significant, urgent one, but there are many others. And we need to be thinking about that. I guess one other observation, I could talk about this subject at great length and probably bore you all to tears, but what I would say, perhaps one important insight that I'd like to share, and that is that whilst to a very large extent we often see in the political economy a desire to have revenues that are raised through climate mitigation taxes or prices be reinvested in pursuit of that same cause. And that's often the case, and politically that's often a very effective way of implementing a reform. But one thing we would say is that if countries are to utilise carbon pricing to the extent that might be necessary to achieve some of the ambitious climate goals that they have set, then we actually think the amount of revenue that could generate is likely to well and truly exceed what might be reinvested back into that specific purpose. And we think that carbon pricing, taxation that is environmentally related, it should not just be seen solely in the context of climate mitigation, because it has an important role to play in our public finances more broadly. And that's important in getting the attention of finance ministries, which is absolutely central if we're going to decarbonise our economies.
Thank you, David. Can I just press you a little on, do you think then that, before I come to you, Jakob, do you think that you talked about this Venn diagram, the overlap, there's a genuine desire to build back better. Do you think that's come as a result from COVID, from that realization that the crisis has come much faster and that therefore there's that broader appetite to move on this, to move on tax as well as other fiscal measures?
Yeah, and look, I'm Australian, and the last time I went back to Australia was Christmas 2020, and we had those horrendous bushfires, and they really were of a scale that I've not witnessed before. And when you see events of that nature, no single event is going to be able to reflect where we're at in terms of climate change. But when you see events of that nature, and then within a matter of months, the world is engulfed by this COVID crisis, these are events of such a magnitude that they really are, they give pause for reflection. And I think public policymakers, recognise that action and urgent action is needed. And the COVID crisis, I think, also shows that when governments do deploy all of their resources with single-minded focus and purpose, you can achieve some pretty remarkable things that in more normal times might not be considered to be possible. So I think there is a recognition about the important role that governments in regulating markets and playing a role in steering the future of our economies and our societies to protect us as citizens and to protect the community from what might be some of the implications of not taking that action.
Wonderful, thank you. And I will add one comment, which I think that to try and summarize is I think the policymakers, I hope, are emboldened by that feeling of urgency. Although we've witnessed some horrific events around the globe, that emboldening and the urgency and the need to make changes quicker hopefully gives a bit of confidence to political decision makers to pass progressive laws. Jakob, I see your hand up and you want to respond to this, and then I'm going to go to the three of the questions that we have in the Q&A. Jakob, please.
I just wanted to add on, you asked for windows of opportunities arising from the current situation, so to say. And I think there are windows of opportunities emerging. And I think Rebecca gave a wonderful example of the shared safe asset. That is something truly novel, an ontological novelty, something new has been born that has never existed before. But I think I would be sort of say careful about about transferring the same reading to the issue of tax policy, especially on the European level. Why? If I look at the surveys that have been conducted long before the Corona crisis, whether people in the EU would support joint taxation policies, I find huge majorities for moves in terms of taxation policies on the European level, as long as these policies are conceived as fair and sensible. So as far as I read the data, the opportunity for being more engaged in tax policy in the EU level, at least when it comes to the popular support, was always there. So I think maybe we have just in the past underestimated our opportunities in the field of European tax policy. At least I want to raise the possibility.
Thank you, Jakob. I'll just give the opportunity to Asmus if you wanted to respond to anything that you've heard. Otherwise, we'll go to questions from the Q&A. Move on. Perfect. We have a few questions now from our listeners. So thank you for typing those in the chat. I will read them verbatim just to give due credit to the writers, and I will join the first two together because they are about the same thing. So forgive me as I read these out. So the two questions are, is current increase, and I'll paste this into our panelist chat as well if you can't see the Q&A, is current increase of energy prices, especially the gas price in Europe, helping the effort for green taxation reforms, or is it adding a problem? Because, for example, now during the transition period, EU industries will probably have to pay higher green taxes whilst dealing with increased energy prices. How do you recommend to communicate this issue? The second and linked question is, do you think the recent energy crisis will impact the future of the energy carbon tax reforms? So I'll just paste those into our panelist chat in case you can't see them. But does anyone want to have a stab at responding to those? So basically, does the increase of energy prices impact on, and the energy crisis impact on the future of energy carbon tax reforms? And is there an issue for industries that are dealing with both paying higher taxes whilst dealing with increased energy prices?
My general sense is that it's harder to make something more expensive when it's already expensive. There certainly is an element of public debate that is inspired by a crisis to really make some lasting reforms. And we've certainly seen, with past debates about peak oil and things like that, people do get concerned. But those people tend to be overwhelmed in the policy process by other people who are specifically impacted by these different constraints. So my overall sense is that when energy is very expensive, it provides market incentives to develop alternatives, but it doesn't really help you, particularly with some of these revenue-raising taxes that are designed to discourage use of already expensive fossil fuels. I mean, you have the market doing that for you. I would like to just jump on something that people said in the previous round, which is that you should never waste a good crisis. So if there is a crisis, that might motivate people to take action. But an energy price crisis is probably not the time to put in an energy tax on top of that, unless you're very careful and or it's really a subsidy to try and get people to move in another direction.
Thank you, Rebecca. And thanks always for being the one to jump in with some immediate and very well-formed thoughts. Does anyone else want to respond to that or to what Rebecca has said? Jakob, I see you unmute yourself.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that basically rising prices is what we need. So from that point of view, it's maybe not the worst news you can get. My suggestion would be to think about following question: how can we achieve that we have constantly rising prices for main energy sources, because in the past 2 decades or so, the prices in the EU practically fluctuated with the world market price, where what we would have needed in that time was a constantly increasing price path. So I'm not enough of a politician to say whether something like that would be doable, but actually some form of administered pricing here would, in my view, be the solution, where I have a higher tax if world market prices go down and a lower tax when world market prices goes up, to make it, so to say, more digestible for the firms. And so, but in my view, this would be, rising prices is a good thing, actually. But we have to ask ourselves the question, to what extent can we moderate this? And yeah.
Thank you, Jakob. David was next, and then I'll go to Erasmus. David, please.
Yeah, look, I certainly agree with Rebecca on this, that this makes things a lot more difficult in some ways. Yes, you know, if pricing is the principal tool, then if prices are increasing, regardless of whether that's driven by government policy or not, then that will have certain behavioural responses and impacts. But as I mentioned earlier, one of the great advantages of pricing, and politically pricing is always difficult, but one of the great advantages of it is that it generates revenues that can be deployed to mitigate some of the distributional impacts, and or perhaps be invested elsewhere that might facilitate the transition even faster. Here you have those price increases without the revenues coming to government. I think that it's always important that policymakers keep their eye on questions of distributional fairness, but also exposure to poverty. And you know, there are a range of instances where prices increasing rapidly can have the impact of putting households at risk of poverty. Now, the challenge there is that the fiscal tools to compensate are not necessarily there because the prices are increasing for a reason other than a carbon price. Perhaps the final point that I would make here is to say that I think what is actually really crucial is the long game, playing the long game. And that's not to say that there shouldn't be a sense of urgency. Please don't misunderstand what I say. But it's about ensuring that everybody is aware that there is a price trajectory and a path that is coming their way over the medium to long term. Now, that doesn't address the short-term shocks, which are very difficult to deal with, as I said before. But I do think it is important that if we are to decarbonise, if we are to make the dramatic shifts in production and consumption patterns, we need to be very clear to people that over the medium to long term, the only way is up. And people need to be assisted through that transition, but as much certainty as we can provide about price trajectories, I think the better.
Thank you, David. I think there was a very crucial point in the middle. I just want to make sure I captured it right. Price increases in energy, which is part of the question, but the revenues are not necessarily going to governments. Is that was part of what you said?
Well, if prices are increasing for a reason, if they're increasing because there's a carbon tax, then the government's generating revenue.
They get the revenue, yeah.
If they're increasing because there's some external shock or some other factor that's driving up energy prices, then the hit to the consumer is the same, but government has not one extra euro to deploy to mitigate the impacts, adverse impacts on distributional concerns, etc. That's the problem.
Yeah, and the benefit then to the consumer from an environmental climate perspective is, well, it's non-existent unless the company is altruistically reinvesting that. Thank you. Erasmus, you wanted to respond to the questions.
Well, I just want, first of all, to bring the current discussion that we open every morning the newspaper and see prices up or down, or trucks or people in the UK without, let's say, fuel. I mean, the package of the Fit for 55, even from the perspective of the Commission, which is very ambitious and proactive, it will take a couple of years to agree. So first of all, these policy measures that we have now on the table that will impact the behavior all the way to the end of this decade and the next decade will be not, let's say, their implementation will take place in a couple of years. So that's one thing. The second, as part of the policy package that we have, and this is an important component, we insist very much on the having a fair package, and we have a social climate fund of 72.5 billion euros to accompany that. And I think in Europe, the Commission, I think the member states, the European Parliament are very, let's say, aware of the need to accompany this transition over time. And the different components of the package, the distribution of the transition among households, industry, aviation, maritime, agriculture, it is taking into account the social impact, and therefore it's important. It's an important component of our policy package and should be an important component of the policy package of any COP26, participant. Last, I think it's inevitable that in, at least for Europe, that part of the policy tools, in our view also for others, they will be market-based. Some will be regulatory-based, some will be tax, some will be market-based. And this component, which is market-based, I think by design it will have, some volatility or some changes over time. So I think we need to take it into account. We need to give it the right weight to this particular tool, and make sure that it provides the right incentives, to where it is targeted to move forward. So I think the incentives of the market mechanism are part of the inherent design, and I think we have to take them into account, and we have to see what is happening on the ground and to adjust, let's say, our package if it does not provide the right incentives. So we did have a very aggressive moving on prices in this last few months, and we have to evaluate during the negotiation of this package, what implications it has for this policy mix.
Thank you, Erismos. If I can come immediately back to you, we've just had one of the questions that's come in the chat, which I think is linked to this and linked to the original question, and I'm actually going to paraphrase this question rather than read it verbatim, is the current public pricing concern an opportunity for the EU? And I think this is coming from the perspective of to link that immediate concern of price with the underlying concern of climate. So making the link really in practice to say, well, here's a very understandable thing to you, the consumer, the public, the prices are going up. Here's the reason why that's happening. And then use that as a bit of a catalyst to get action on climate solutions and to explain the response being taken by decision makers.
I don't think that the link is so big in terms of policy design. It's one thing for the politicians and how they will do, but in terms of policy design, let's take our policy framework develops, is developed in a way to get us carbon neutral in 2050, and then we move back, and then we move to 2030, and that's why we look at that. And then, as I explained in the Energy Taxation Directive, we have a backloaded mechanism. So we don't have any pricing elements in the beginning. All the energy taxation, the minimum rates, it's not a harmonized rate, they are a bit backloaded. So I think we need to take into account, if you take cars, our regulations on cars will effectively the proposal of the Commission will very much reduce the scope of combustion engine cars by 2035. So there is this predictability, for everybody, if our proposal goes through, that at some stage combustion engines will be dramatic. Sales of new combustion engines and cars with combustion engines will go out. We have a complementary package of rolling out incentives for replacement of cars, of rolling out electrification, and therefore we have a 15-year program on how to get from A to B. And I think what is important for the policymakers, is to see whether this timetable and this package works. And so it's a matter of getting the right, let's say, policy mixture design, rather than fixing your eyes in one element and then say, I need to fix this, whichever this one element is would be.
Thank you, Erasmus. We are coming towards the end of our session. We've got 4 minutes left. I believe it's a hard stop. I'd like to give the opportunity to our panelists to make any last reflections they have, or to answer the last question that we have that has come through. And if you could be brief, that would be much appreciated. The last question we have is, what prospects does the panel see for an international agreement like the Inclusive Framework for Environmental or Carbon Taxation? I hope that makes sense to you. And if so, should this deal be done under the auspices of the OECD or under the UN? Feel free to respond to that specific question, or to just give a last reflection from your side, and then I'll wrap up the session. I see both. I didn't see who unmuted first there between Rebecca and Jakob. I'll let Jakob go first this time to give you more thinking time, Rebecca. Jakob.
Thanks. 3 things. First, regarding the question, I do not think an international agreement is so realistic, but I would say that the carbon border adjustment mechanism is an inspiration of how to unilaterally go in this direction and try to enforce something. Second remark is, you asked me about path breaking, areas where path breaking is needed, and I think there are a lot of examples I forgot, like the advent of the circular economy, the erection, the implementation of a pan-European railway system, the transfer to hydrogen-based production in steel, and so on. So there are a lot of specific examples that we have to take seriously, I think. And finally, my final remark is, I'm happy to see such broad agreement. I think we all agree what are the challenges. I think we agree what are the tools. Maybe we differ on the weightings with regard to how much to use which tool. So maybe a question that remains open is, how radical shall we be? And here I can just say, my oldest son is 13 years old. He can now digest the IPCC report, and he really is angry. So maybe to get things going at home again, it would be great if we be more radical.
Wonderful, thank you, Jakob. I'm glad your son is reading the IPCC report. I certainly wasn't at age 13. Rebecca, please.
Thanks very much. On Todd's question about carbon pricing, I am kind of a skeptic of carbon markets generally. I think it's a very well-intentioned and possibly ultimately successful effort by governments to push carbon usage and the economy where they want it. But I also think it's really hard, and I think it doesn't work as a market. So you have this inherent tension between government intervention and what the economy is trying to do. And that just strikes me as a hard way to do it. It may be the way forward. Some of my colleagues at Bruegel have made very compelling cases that it is, but it seems to me to be really an uphill battle compared to other ways that work with market trends to try and make the changes we want. As a closing remark, we got a follow-up comment, if those of you who are looking at the Q&A, about the answer on EU policy, saying, and I quote, "Citizens are not concerned with EU policy. It is too complex. They are concerned about their priorities today, and they care about climate." This comment encapsulates a lot of what is so hard about this. As I was saying earlier, there is a core group of people, to which I think this questioner may belong, who really care about climate and who really want to push for this. And those people are a little bit in their own bubble from the other people who are busy dealing with the price increases and dealing with their day-to-day concerns, and who might kind of abstractly like to help the climate, but who are much more concerned with how they're going to pay their employees and get paid by their employer and move forward. The main policy instrument we have to get these two groups of people moving in the same direction is EU policy. It is big, it is complicated, and it is incremental. And this, to me, I am a huge fan of incremental change. I think that is how people move forward, even when we have these great leap forward political agreements in crises, or through, for example, the OECD corporate tax deal, which may politically come together this fall. It still takes a lot of technical work. It takes a lot of people compromising, edging things forward. And to the extent we can get the climate activists recommitted to using the institutions and not just railing about how ineffective they are, that will help. And likewise, to the extent we can get the public thinking that these incremental changes are going to help them and not just raise their prices or get them laid off, that will help everyone. So there is a real opportunity here. But it's a framing question. It's the idea that a whole lot of small changes can, just like a whole lot of small decisions to lead to global warming, have a big long-term impact.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rebecca. David, I'd like to go to you next and then finish with Gerasimos in terms of reflections. David, please.
Well, it's hard to come in after Rebecca on that note. But look, can I just conclude by thanking you all for the opportunity to contribute some of our thinking on these issues. I don't want to get into the detail of the specifics of an inclusive framework on carbon pricing or anything of that nature, other than to say that I think there is a lot of ambition. Increasingly, there is a lot of ambition coming from countries, and that is to be welcomed, because ambition is going to be required if we are to tackle the worst effects of dangerous climate change. But just as important as ambition is being able to translate that into the policies, the plans, the programs that will deliver that. And that is where it's incredibly difficult. And there are policymakers within the EU and beyond the EU grappling with these questions. At the OECD, we're here to help. That's our message. In any way that we can, by deploying research capability, policy advice, broader support, we're here to help. And that's not to the exclusion of any other international organisation, because the future of the planet and humanity is something that I think trumps all of those considerations. So great to be able to contribute to the discussion today.
Wonderful. Thank you, David. And thank you for stepping in the last minute. I think that here to help message is well received. Jakob said we agree. Rebecca says we agree. It's not necessarily on exactly how we move forwards, but we do need to move forwards. Gerasimos, I'd like to give you the final word for any reflections and thoughts that you have, and then I'll close the session, please.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I don't have much time. I have to join another meeting. I want to thank, I think we had a very, coherent discussion pointing to the same direction. And I want to thank the panelists, which I meet for the first time, but, and I'm very glad to hear their ideas and having participated in the debate. I will finish by saying two things. First of all, I do get, like Jakob, the heat from my children. My daughter is the climate activist, demonstrating on the street. So I have, and the young people are, impassioned, and we have to listen to them. Second, as a personal, let's say, proof of the way I see things. I was the minister responsible for environment and energy in Greece. I wrote and I legislated the decision of the Greek government last year to bring forward the closing of coal power plants from lignite power plants from 2045 to at the latest 2028. In fact, all of them by 2023 and one to 2028. This policy works very well with social cohesion. I negotiated with the unions, with the miners. It works. People, even when they are personally affected, they understand that the future is one direction. You have to accompany, you have to engage. And the Prime Minister of Greece has announced this weekend that the 2028 will become 2025. So that's where I stand when I have to make these decisions. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Erasmus. And I really like the young people are impassioned and we need to listen to them point. I think that's essential. We are short on time. I know everyone needs to leave for various other meetings, and I hope you can go back and tell your children that you have had a good discussion. You are working hard on this. I know we all are. Thank you for those reflections. It's been a pleasure to step into this discussion from my side, hear the debate. I wish we were in the same room, hopefully soon. Thank you to our panelists for animating the discussion, for being very considerate and clear in your communication. It makes my job really very simple. Thank you to everyone who's listened to engage with the Q&A. I've certainly learned a lot in the process. I hope you have as well. And we'll see now how we move forwards with ETD reforms. Wishing you all the luck there, Erasmus, in getting those through. And I know all of our institutes and organizations will be putting out further analysis and research on this. So with that, everyone, thank you for joining us.
I will offer a job to Jakob so that he can help me with ETD.
There you go, Jakob. What an offer. Wonderful. Thank you, everyone.